So the other thing that's a really important part of the Articles of Confederation was that they had to deal with the large debt. How to deal with that and ratify taxes, federal taxes, to pay the loans. Now, if you think about it, each state was paying its own taxes to run the state, to better the cities, to expand and create a mail system that works, and protect itself against and create trade within its states to other states and also across the triangle trade back to Europe. Taxes were needed for that. It was this Articles of Confederation, this government that was for all the states, that was the ones dealing with the foreign debt of money that was given to other countries and other foreign entities, or that had bonds during the war that needed to pay out, or there was lots of officers, there was lots of military veterans that weren't paid. And the problem was, it came to a head in 1785 when the Confederation, up to their neck in taxes, requested $3 million. If you remember, if you think about it, they were auctioning off acres of land for $1. So imagine having a $3 million request for taxes to all 13 colonies. That was 4 times larger than the year before. Imagine now being asked for 4 times the taxes from the last year. That's what's happening here. And it was exponentially, it was impossible to pay. It would have actually, if they did do it, it would have destroyed many of the states, because the amount of money that was paid was way more than their gross domestic product, their money they were actually making. So many states refused to pay altogether. Hey, the Confederation had no way to really stop them. Some states issued abundance paper money. So they're like, fine, we print our own paper. We'll just print you, what, you want $1 million? We'll print out $1 million, send it your way. So inflation skyrockets. Dollar is inflated unbelievably. And insurgents started to rally together to shut down courthouses that were trying to pass tax laws. They were shutting down ports that were trying to get more taxes, and people hit the streets. It was a big deal. It was the beginning of a new revolution. If you remember the Stamp Act that was imposed by the British government, this is along the same lines. This is where you start to see history repeat itself. And if they continued along the same road, there was going to be another revolution. One major leader of this, famous leader, was Captain Daniel Shea. He was captain in the Revolutionary War. He was a war veteran. And many of the other were not just poor farmers or just illiterate people that sometimes is portrayed with the Shays Rebellion. These were veterans. These were sometimes landowners, and these were sometimes just small farmers, and in some cases freed slaves. These were everybody. And rich merchants alike. But you'll see a lot of the other rich merchants went against this. But him and his veterans, and himself as a veteran, who stood up and were remembering the Revolutionary War. Remember what they were fighting for. They were fighting against the taxation and the tyrannies of government. And now they're being called to do something extraordinary and impossible, and taxation without any real cause or able to maintain it. So they rose against it, and the chapter talks about it very deeply. So be sure to check that out. And the problem was, too, you have the social media of its time, the newspaper, Boston newspaper, saying that Shay's plan was to burn Boston to the ground and overthrow the government. So they were really making it worse than it really was. They weren't trying to overthrow the government. They're trying to get the government to listen to their demands. They fought for the government. In a lot of ways, they loved the government. But they wanted to make sure the government heard them, and that they could talk. This was their way of doing a dialogue with the government, saying, we cannot pay that. Change your laws. But the Boston's newspaper created the problem of saying they're a bunch of terrorists. They're going to destroy it. That's not the case. And then also the Confederation the Continental Congress did not have any rights to have a standing army after the war. So there wasn't any way to stop them. Instead, there was in Boston, for example, there was a militia that was formed, largely money from very rich merchants of the city who feared for their merchandise and for their goods. They did not want to lose that. They can afford the taxes that was given to them. They also probably had many tax breaks, but they raised an army to fight against Shay. This Shay's army was trying to get to an ammunition, be able to give arms to their own men, and also to really stop the militia from getting the guns that they needed. However, that was interrupted. They were able to be stopped. Eventually, the whole thing was a disaster for the rebellion, but the legacy and remembrance lived on. And it played a key role for how people, the founding fathers, how the people in the government were to make the next step. It really was a wake-up call for the government. Benjamin Franklin, who now is an old dude, he said, talking about the Shays' Rebellion and what's happening and these uprising against taxes, is that this is a defect of obedience in subjects. So there's already, very early in the United States, there's a disconnect and a amnesia. They're forgetting that the very things that they were fighting against the British are things they're doing now. And that must be remembered, because that's what Shay's Rebellion was trying to make a point in telling the government to not forget what they were fighting for in the first place. It did lead to change. And so what you have after that is a call and a wake-up call that the government was not working. It was not powerful enough, and it did not create the glue anymore that the nation needed to hold each state together. So James Madison and others, Alexander Hamilton was one that was there, and 55 others. They first met in Annapolis, and the idea was to re-examine the Articles of Confederation, and sort of everyone knew that it wasn't working. Everyone knew that it just wasn't up to speed. Those three things were not enough to hold a government together. It was not enough glue to hold each state together, that we needed to re-look at that and to create something new. So the first meeting led to a second meeting where 55 men got together in 1787 to then re-look at the government itself and to reform something new, back to the drawing board. Important thing is that this was done in secret. This was not publicized. And that was largely to really allow the ideas to flow. This is like the Enlightenment ideals in full effect. They knew that they were at a crossroad. If they kept going the direction they're going, they're going to have to tax the way they were. They're going to go down the same road as the British government. There'll be more uprising. And before you know it, the writing would be on the wall that even though the French Revolution wasn't at this stage yet with their reign of terror, that was the direction they would have gone if they didn't make serious changes. And so the Philadelphia Convention really sets the tone for the rebirth again of the American government and what would become the United States as we see it today. If you think about it, if you were transported to the government in 1787, you wouldn't recognize it. You wouldn't understand really how it's running compared to after the Philadelphia Convention and after the development of the U.S. Constitution. Then you'd be able to recognize a United States that you can see and understand. So this really sets the stage for a government of the United States that we have today. But it was a long journey. It wasn't just 55 people coming together and saying, you know what, this is a good idea. Let's create a new government. We know exactly what to do. It had to be argued and fought for. And there was many different plans that came up with, even ideas of monarchy, because of course they knew that worked. That is the government that's been happening for centuries, for millennia. But now they're trying something new. They believed in the ideas of the Enlightenment. They believed in the rational thought. They believed in the contract of government, that the people had the rights, and together they can run the country in a way very different. So James Madison, who brought everyone together in the first place, he had his plan, which became known as the Virginia Plan. And this remember, the states had the strongest power. You have to remember that the Articles of Confederation, first and foremost, the state had the power. The individual person gave up some of their rights to the state government. Remember, in all governments, you have a contract where an individual gives up some of their rights for the government to act on their behalf and protect them. That's every government. That's the idea of it. But in this case, what James Madison's saying is we need to reject the state sovereignty and have a national sovereignty. So the individual's not giving up their rights to the state, they're giving up their rights to a nation. That's a very different view, and that's going to create some conflict. The other side of that is also, it's directly from the people. So that's, again, saying the people, they're giving up some of their rights, and they're giving up their sovereignty, not the state, but to the country itself. So yes, they're Virginians. So yes, they're Massachusetts, but they are Americans first and foremost. That was very different than how it was before. He also talks about setting up a 3-tier government. So it's great having a powerful leader. We need a leader to run the nation. We need one person. Each state had its own governor. We now need someone to be a governor of the country, or the president, as they come to it, the executive branch. And so they need a 3-tier government that he calls into play. He just says there needs to be a lower house, an upper house. In his mind, probably it's looking at the House of Commons and the House of Lords. That's what's happening in England. That's what he would be familiar with. But here he's saying we need 2 houses. We need 2 chambers. We need a lower house. We need a higher house. We need the executive and judiciary. We need a law of executive authority, and we also need a law. We need the judiciary branch. So it's very similar. You're going to recognize some things, but with some caveats. However, he did not come up with this by himself. None of these ideas come out of a vacuum. He largely, if you look at the Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws, what he wrote in 1748, James Madison definitely had a highlighter, if they had a highlighter back then, but he had this book, and he was definitely laid out his Virginia plan based on Montesquieu, because in that he talks about liberty best preserved in government whose powers are divided among 3 branches: executive, legislative, and judicial. And then he breaks up the importance of a binary system, and then rather than, or a bicameral, so a 2-chamber system rather than an unicameral system. So you need to have those splits to be able to have checks and balances in the government. That's what he talks about. And that was the Virginia plan. So the other side of that is the New Jersey plan. And it's easy to see it in contrast to the Virginia plan. So the bicameral, which Latin, 2 chambers, as opposed to a 1-chamber system. So Virginia plan, of course, Madison's calling for the legislative, judicial, and a 2 higher and lower house. New Jersey plan's calling for a 1 system but every state receives 1 vote, and not giving up the rights of the state. The New Jersey plan, opposed to the Virginia plan, was all about the state rights and a very, very, very limited federal government. That your rights as an individual was to the state, and then the state represented you at the federal level. Does that make sense? So if you vote for anything, you would be voting for the state. You'd be voting for the person, maybe the governor, whoever was the body, and that body was then to be your vote from the state to the government. That was the New Jersey plan. Between this 2 and between great debate and lots of talking, there was the Great Compromise, which did provide the bicameral system and created the House of Representatives, and which satisfied the Virginia plan, but also a Senate, which had 2 senators, which was satisfied by the New Jersey plan. So those were able to then represent the people. House of Representatives was also according to the population. So a certain amount of people went to the House of Representatives, and every state had 2 senators. Both the House and Congress must pass every law. So the law went through both houses and was the checks and balance for the system. This is very similar, and it gets in great detail in the chapter, but I wanted to just lay out and make sure you understood the difference between the Virginia and the New Jersey plan. Now, you might think, well, of course, duh, that makes sense. Always have two systems in place, two different houses. That makes sense. That's a check and balance. Why would you have one house? Well, it's important to understand that even today, Armenia, Bulgaria, Denmark, Hungary, Monaco, Ukraine, Serbia, Turkey, Sweden, all have a one-chamber system. And in fact, some that had a two-chamber system in the 20th century switched to a one-chamber system. Greece, New Zealand, Peru all switched from a two-house system to a one-house system because of the way they viewed government, and they saw that as a more efficient form of government. So even today, it's not exactly clear or written in stone what an effective government really is. So now that the plan was made, they had to agree. They had to get the states to vote on this, and they had to have the states ratify the Constitution. So this plan that they came in place, the Great Compromise, which brings together the Virginia-New Jersey plan and other important points, was a hard thing to swallow at this time period. This was a hard pill to take. A government system that was for the whole country and took away state rights and took away individual rights to the state when everything was for the state. If you were traveling around talking to people, you didn't say you were an American. You wouldn't even say in colonial times you were American. You would say, yes, you're a British subject, that's a given, but you are a proud Virginian. You're a proud New Yorker. You're a proud Massachusetts or Georgian. That's who you were. That was the identity. So to give up some of that identity for a national federal government was an incredibly impossible task. And to do that, you had to, the Federalists, those on the side of the Constitution, those trying to ratify the Constitution, those in favor of this new government, had to convince others. So you have on the other side the Anti-Federalist, and I love there was this was one of the things written that you could kind of see that everyone was involved, not just the rich aristocracy of its time, but it was written that these lawyers and men of learning and money that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor, illiterate people swallow down the pill, expect to get into Congress themselves. They expect to be the managers of the Constitution and get all the power and all the money into their own hands. And they will swallow up us little folk. Does that sound familiar? In a day of the 21st century with turmoil in governments, turmoil with presidencies, and ideas of what makes a good government or what makes a good leader and what doesn't, this is still the narrative you hear today. These men of learning, these strong businessmen, they are trying to take all the power themselves. They are trying to take all the money. They're trying to put the power in their own hands. They're trying to manage the Constitution, take away our rights from the little folk. And this was the argument of the Anti-Federalists. They did not see the Constitution as protecting their rights rather than taking it away, and definitely taking it away from their state rights. So to help put this all together, you had the Federalist Papers. You had Alexander Hamilton writing many of them. Now, famously in the play, Alexander Hamilton, which we had the section a couple weeks ago that talked about him in connection with the musical, it said that he wrote 55 of the Federalist Papers, the majority. That is in dispute. Because, of course, these were anonymous. They did not put their names to them. It was a radical move to make, this trying to ratify the Constitution, and it could have been destruction to their political careers. So a lot of this was done in secret, the meetings. A lot of these Federalist Papers were done unanimous or were done anonymously. And so we only can speculate who wrote what based on the verbiage of how they wrote. Some people said Alexander Hamilton wrote that many, 55. Other people think James Madison actually wrote quite a few more. And John Jay, of course, got sick and only wrote a few. But it is in dispute who James Madison or Alexander Hamilton wrote the majority. So just something to keep in mind. Give James Madison more credit. He did quite a bit. In fact, remember, he brought everyone together in the convention in the first place. But it's important that their work, hard work, within 100 days, was able to then turn it around and create a whole new government that lays the bedrock for the United States. Looking at maps of elections is not new to the United States. It's something. So if you look at this map, even and kind of shows you some of the regions who were for the ratification of the Constitution and those not. Look at that. Most people, most areas in North Carolina were looking for against it. We're looking for, you could kind of think of this as we're more for the state rights rather than a federal right. So this was an important one. The places, you could think of the cities in here. Some of these cities turned to ratification. Same as South Carolina, especially on the seaboard. And if you look at here, all along the seaboard, mostly are the ones that are ratifying it. So, there's a lot of documentation. There's lots of great books and lots of things out there to explain, well, who were the people interested in ratification? Who were those against? Chapter 8 talks about it. But think about the pros and cons. What were the pros and cons of the Articles of Confederation? Yes, there were state rights. Individuals knew that they were giving up for their state, and that directly was part and protecting them. They were not sure how a federal government was going to do it, and they were afraid that such a government would turn into something like the British government, with a king, a monarch. They did not know that they were going to have someone like George Washington or other presidents down the road. They just knew what they knew. They just knew from experience that that was not going to be right. They weren't going to have the rights. And giving up any rights to a federal government was very scary and very, very challenging and a huge risk to take. So, but in the end of the day, they were able to do that. They were able to create the Constitution. They were able to ratify this. Of course, we're going to talk about in another lecture the Bill of Rights, which are the amendments to the Constitution. But this was an important first stage to set the stage and the bedrock for the United States of America.